Good morning, everybody. Afternoon for my co-host and guest. And I'm Nick Rishwain. Welcome to Legal Tech Live, episode 31. Today we will be covering drones and drone law with Mark Dombroff. Mark is an attorney from DentonsUS out in DC. And he has been concentrating his practice on the aviation and transportation industries, including litigation, regulatory, administrative enforcement matters for NTSB investigations, airport and aircraft security, and employment issues. He also leads the firm's unmanned aircraft systems practice, the UAS practice, and which is why we've brought Mark on today. And I will tell you a little bit more about this UAS. In 2014, he founded the annual UAS Symposium to address the growing body of drone laws and regulations. My thought was that it was all federal and FAA based, but there are a lot of local and state issues related to this. The symposium panels composed of FAA, insurance, and industry representatives discuss such topics as FAA appropriation issues, legal and regulatory obstacles in deployment of anti-drone technologies, the Part 107 waiver process, and state and local drone laws. So, Mark, we are very happy to have you here today. I've got my co-host, Ivan Rakelin. Ivan, would you like to introduce yourself to Mark?
Yeah, before I introduce myself, I just want to basically say that to sum everything up that you just said, you're looking at the general of UAS in the legal tech community. So that's like the tagline.
That's the tagline.
So with
You're
that
right.
said, I'm just a little pawn in this whole game that hopefully will facilitate some good discussion and healthy dialogue. Ivan Rakelin, recovering lawyer, I like to say, diplomat, Green Beret, turned startup investor and advisor, who not only accidentally ran 50 miles once, but I think now has done 31 episodes accidentally with Nick Rishwain over the last few years on Legal Tech. With that, we need to just jump in because I don't want to waste a lot of time on us because you have this expertise that very few people have, and I'd like to make sure that we can share as much as possible.
Yeah. So, Mark, what did we miss? And there is a very long bio on the Dentons website. You've had quite the distinguished career in aviation. What have we missed that you would maybe want to add to kind of sum up this really fantastic career in aviation law?
Well, I appreciate that very much, Nick, and I want to thank both Ivan and you for having me. This is really a wonderful opportunity. It's not the typical bar association type of presentation, which makes it much more enjoyable. The observation I'd like to make is I've been involved in aviation, the aviation industry and aviation law my entire career, and I hesitate at this point in my career to say how long it is because all it is a comment upon how old I am. But as we were briefly chatting before you went live, a number of years ago, in about 2012, 2013, when shortly after Congress mandated that the FAA integrate drones into the national airspace system, I sort of sat back, and I actually started my career as an FAA lawyer, but I sort of sat back and looked at it and said, these are nothing but airplanes. They're going to be regulated by the FAA on a going forward basis. It's not going to take 114 years. The Wright brothers flew in 1903, and it isn't going to take 114 years to get to where we are today in aviation in the context of drones and UAS. It's going to develop a lot more quickly. So let's take the expertise we've got in the aviation industry and move it over into the drone world. And I think that, in fact, if I look back over the last 3-4 years, while it's developing somewhat slowly because the FAA is moving pretty methodically, and people can criticize it and put a different term on the word methodically, it's developing exactly the way aviation developed. It took 114 years. As I say, it won't take 114 years for drones, but anybody who understands how aviation has developed from a regulatory and a legal perspective really should have a very good understanding of what's going to happen over the course of the next, let's say, decade in terms of the drone world.
Now, Mark, since you do have the context, you didn't say the number of years. I'll give a hint. It's about my age. But anyway, if you could give some context, essentially, not the 117 years, but essentially from when you started seeing some sort of legal activity in the drone space,
sure.
in the history, generally the history of drones. We know
what's really very interesting, Ivan, is when the FAA Act, the 1958 FAA Act was enacted, the obligation of the FAA was to promote and regulate aviation. And when you think about that, those two mandates, promote on the one hand and regulate on the other hand, are really not consistent. And the FAA for many years worked with this dual mandate. They promoted the industry, and they would also regulate it. They were, in effect, the police. That changed, and Congress recognized that this was inconsistent, and so they made the FAA exclusively the regulators, and that's what they are today. They're the regulators of aviation. The difference in the drone world, and it's kind of interesting, is that Congress basically mandated that the FAA do the same things, to promote and to regulate. They didn't use those same words, but in fact, that's the dual mandate the FAA is operating with. So they find, on the one hand, they want to promote drone usage, they want to promote the industry, but on the other hand, they want to regulate it as they integrate it in with fixed-wing airplanes and helicopters. And I think in large measure, that's what probably is accounting for. And then there are some other more unique situations that account for the pace, or the lack of pace, if you will, with which the FAA is promulgating regulations and sort of opening up the airspace system. But if you look at the way fixed-wing regulation developed, and the FAA sort of acts in that space, there are an awful lot of parallels in the context of drones. And if somebody wants to know what is the drone world going to look like in 10 years, look at the aviation world. Pilots have to be certificated. They've got to show their proficiency. They have to do it on an annual basis in some instances, depending upon their level of certification. The equipment, the airplanes have to be certified. There have to be certified maintenance programs, certified safety programs. If you look at that in the context of aviation, and then you look at where the drone world would like to go in terms of the industry, beyond visual line of sight, autonomous operations, larger drones, larger payloads, the fact of the matter is we are going to have certification of the airplanes, of the drones. We're going to have higher and higher levels and different levels of certification of the pilots. They're going to be mandated maintenance programs, mandated safety, mandated training. The world that the drone world, Part 107, knows today is going to look a lot more like the fixed wing world that we have today. But it's not going to take, as I said, 114 years.
Very good. Now, this was interesting to me. What I know, and I'm the one in this group who doesn't fly a drone. I don't do that yet. I haven't done that yet, but not that I don't want to. I just haven't taken on that hobby. But can you explain to me why my understanding of drones? I used to call them unmanned aerial vehicles. UAV was the terminology I was familiar with. But in preparing for this today, I noticed that you're calling it UAS, or unmanned aerial systems. So has that been a change in the last, say, 10 or 12 years? Or what would be the difference between UAV and UAS?
I think as a practical matter, Nick, I think anybody who talks about it sort of is talking about the same thing and understands it to be the same thing. But here's the difference. The technology is not new. If you think about it, the technology we've had for decades on the defense side. We all hear about, and there are movies about the 25-year-old Air Force pilot who sits in an air-conditioned container in Arizona or Nevada, watches TV screens, takes a drone off from someplace in Europe, flies it to another place in the Mideast, delivers a, quote, package, turns around, lands it, and then may fly another mission or may pack his stuff up and go home to his wife and his little kid. The technology is not new. What's new is that in 2012, Congress mandated the FAA to integrate that technology into the national airspace system, which is occupied by everything from general aviation to helicopters to the commercial airplanes. The FAA, I suspect, if we had been a fly on the wall, probably had a discussion at some point about not referring to what's happening on the commercial civil side as drones. Okay. Because it conjures up everything that we've just talked about, the defense-oriented use of drones. The UAS, Unmanned Aircraft Systems, is a recognition of the fact, or unmanned aerial systems, is a recognition of the fact that it's not just the vehicle, that it's also the pilot, the operator on the ground. So it's an unmanned aircraft system. Now, there's been some push, and I've read about this recently, that really to refer them as remotely piloted vehicles. Okay. Now, look, to me, it's 6 of one, half dozen of the other. I remember a very early interview with Brian Wynn's predecessor as the president of AUVSI, and the media was just starting to cover drones. I'll call them drones. Was just starting to cover drones. It was at the AUVSI annual meeting, and whoever was doing the interviewing from the media actually talked about this subject and said, you know, they're called unmanned aircraft systems, and I forgot the fellow's name, but his response was, well, we can call them anything you want, but they're drones. Okay. So the fact is, I think we all have a common understanding, but there is sort of a fine distinction, because we are talking about a system that has one component in the air and another component, namely the pilot or operator on the ground.
So, but according to FAA definitions, you would say that UAS is the term of art that they use and define, and then probably drones is more the vernacular that...
I think that's absolutely right, Ivan. The FAA is sort of settled on UAS, unmanned aircraft systems, but, you know, I think just as the common usage is a drone.
Okay. Excellent. Ivan, this is your area, man.
All right. So, as obviously... just so for some of the viewers, like the two, like yourself, Mark, you do have a drone, and I do like to fly a drone. Although I am in the controlled airspace of Washington, D.C. Actually, let's talk a little bit about that. In general, what are the general rules out there for controlled airspace where you can and can't use drones? We'll go into specifically the Virginia ATIS or the D.C. ATIS, since both of us are, at least I'm in it. I think you're just outside of it. And then where you see that going forward?
Well, I think that's probably one of the hottest or most debated subjects in the drone world right now is where can you fly them? You know, we all know that when you operate under Part 107 and you're flying either as a commercial operation under 107, or you're even flying as a hobbyist, just generally, it's 400 feet or below. And then there's restrictions on weight and speed and so forth and so on. There are operations that take place higher than 400 feet, but just as a general matter, we're looking at 400 feet and below, and it's 400 feet above the surface and below. Now, when you start thinking about, well, why is that? You look at the federal aviation regulations, and just as a caveat, the federal aviation regulations are part of a whole set of regulations published in what's called the Code of Federal Regulations. And every government agency, the regulations that they promulgate go into their section of the Code of the Federal Regulations. So if it's the Food and Drug Administration or it's the Securities and Exchange Commission, they all have their own regulations. The FAA's regulations are the Federal Air Regulations. And it's Title 14 of the Code of Federal Regulations. And that's where you get airspace and operating rules. the distance you have to be from people, the distance you have to be from buildings or property, and so forth. So the real reason that you had exemptions, initially you had the Section 333 exemptions, when the FAA first started to mandate the will of Congress to integrate drones. You couldn't operate drones in the navigable airspace system, which the FAA takes the general position, and one can talk about this for a whole hour or so, is from the ground up. You couldn't operate drones in the navigable airspace system. And the reason you couldn't do it is you couldn't comply with the federal aviation regulations. And I'll give you like two really sort of obvious examples. To operate an airplane in the national airspace system, you've got to have an operating manual on board the airplane. Secondly, you have to have a registration number, not unlike a license plate, on the side of the airplane, and the numbers, the letters and the numbers have to be at least 6 to 12 inches high. And so every airplane has an N number, N 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Well, it gets pretty obvious on the drone you held up, Ivan. There's no place to put the manual. There's there's no place to put the registration number in the size that the FAA mandates. So you needed an exemption under Section 333 of the legislation, the 2012 legislation, and the exemption was to operate exempt from certain federal aviation regulations. So when people got those exemptions, they probably didn't realize that they were operating with exemptions to federal regulations. Now, Section 107 is passed, and that's Section 107 of the Federal Aviation Regulations. So the FAA put out a whole new section of the federal regulations to address drones. The area that remains really the subject of study and scrutiny is how do you manage the airspace? And the NASA is involved in working on this with the FAA. The FAA has several working groups looking at this. But the question really becomes, do you reserve exclusive blocks of airspace just for drones? In other words, there's one proposal I've heard about that says 100 feet and below is exclusively for drones. Now, that's all well and good, so long as you recognize that helicopters are at some point in time going to have to fly 100 feet and below to be able to take off and land, and not necessarily from airports. Because helicopters are going to land next to the highway, they're going to land on the highway, they're going to land in backyards and parks.
Right, for medical purposes.
Exactly. And at the same time, airplanes are going to be transiting through 100 feet or below, and they're transiting through 400 feet and below, but that's always at airports, in the vicinity of airports. Now, there's already a restriction. You can't operate a drone within 5 miles of an airport, but we hear about a lot of encounters or sightings by helicopters of drones. Mm-hmm. Now, it's nowhere near an airport when that may occur. So the issue is really harmonizing the use of the airspace by the drone with the existing use of the airspace by fixed wing and helicopters. And that's a whole area that the FAA currently has studying. Probably one of the best examples I can give as to why this is so important is if we're going to have package delivery and we're going to have, beyond visual line of sight operations, whether it's for package delivery, railroad track inspection, power line inspection, any of these areas.
And then human delivery, right?
Exactly. It's going to have to operate at relatively low altitudes. And so the FAA really has to be focused and concerned not only about protecting the people in the air, in the aircraft or in the helicopters, but also protecting people on the ground. Right. So how do you harmonize all these various issues? And that's an area that's still very much, in a sense, I hesitate to use this phrase, up in the air, so to speak.
All right.
So let me just follow up with that. So I just put in a brief comment I'm aware of an app called Before You Fly that FAA
Yes.
just launched. Now, is there a version of that online that you've seen, or is it just on the phone? Because, for example, if I want to travel and I want to plan out my route, maybe using my drone, is there a place that I can do that? Because it seems as though the app is not very robust, if you will. It's pretty clunky.
Yeah, I think, again, these are all, in many respects, works in progress, if you will. I've seen it on the app. I've on the phone. I've used it in the sense of sort of playing around with it. I honestly can't answer it. Maybe somebody who's tuned in to this can tell us. I haven't gone online to see if there's actually one online. What's kind of interesting, and I think people probably don't realize this, is the FAA is a really huge organization, and right now they've got a lot of issues confronting them. One is getting their budget and their money and the FAA authorization passed, and that's still up in the air out there. They have the big issue and controversy regarding the privatization of the air traffic control system. All of the air traffic controllers, I won't say all of them, but most of them in the United States are FAA employees. The towers, most towers are managed, run by the FAA. In Canada, it's different. In Canada, the air traffic control system is privatized. It's actually run by an entity, sort of a public-private entity called NAV Canada. There's a big move, big push afoot among various segments of the aviation industry to privatize the air traffic control system in the United States. And it all has to do with private industry can move faster than the government can. And I think that's generally true. So innovations in technology and other changes can be made more quickly if it's privatized. Now, the reason I mention all of this is, as big an organization as the FAA is, virtually all things drone are concentrated in an organization of the FAA headquartered in Washington known as AFS Flight Standards 80. It's their routing symbol. And it's the office that is headed by Earl Lawrence, who I'm sure many of the listeners to the podcast here know that name. And my colleague, Jim Williams, was his predecessor. But it's all concentrated in that one office. So everything that we read about, everything that everybody reads about regarding drones and Part 107 and beyond visual line of sight and everything that the FAA is doing is all coming out of this one office. And so it's not like the FAA has 1,000 people assigned. And the reason I mention that is if there's a recognition of that fact, and I think it's actually a positive thing, because you really don't want lots of people in the bureaucracy moving off in different directions in an area that is really in its infancy, and that's drones. But it does account for the pace in many instances. And I think we're going to see a lot more sophistication, whether it's in the app or any other area. I'll make one other observation. Right now, I would go out and say that the aviation industry in the world, and certainly in the United States, it's 100% mature. We're going to have more technological developments. We're going to have more innovations. But essentially, it's 100% mature. In that context, I have always said in the drone world, the UAS world, we're at about the 15 or 20% level. That's as far as we are. And so the impatience that so many people have about why isn't the FAA doing this? Why aren't they promulgating the rules faster? Why can't we have package delivery beyond visual line of sight? People have to step back, understand it's taken 114 years to get the safest airspace in the world. And the U.S. has the safest airspace in the world. And the FAA is not about to do anything to compromise that.
Okay.
And that was going to be my kind of next follow-up. What I'm reading from just a layperson's point of view. So right now, what I'm seeing is recreational use mostly around my area. but there is a big push for commercial use in drones and drone delivery. And from the layperson's perspective, I'm seeing that push mostly from the likes of Amazon for package delivery. Who are the main stakeholders in, other than those that I see for the commercial uses or the recreational uses, who are the commercial stakeholders who are really having a push for regulations? And they would be probably the ones I anticipate who would be saying that the regulations are going too slowly.
I think that's a fair observation, and certainly Amazon, who's already testing package delivery over in England, is clearly on the cutting edge of technology. There's no question about that. I think Amazon, it defines technology in many instances. Mm-hmm. But if you look at just industry generally, if you look at the commercial world generally, railroads, inspection of tracks, it's a very time-consuming process that the railroads have to follow. They put trucks out there. They have to run all the tracks. The idea of putting drones out there with sensors hanging from them in which they can check welds, they can check track condition, power line inspection, flare stacks, those gigantic big smokestacks have the flames at the top burning off gases. It's very expensive to inspect those because they have to shut them down, let them cool off. Anything that may involve a helicopter by way of inspection, cell towers, obviously agriculture. I've heard speculation of the effect that agriculture is going to be the single largest user of drones, whether it's for field and crop management or it's the actual application of product. And I think that given the fact that a drone isn't going to carry either 500 gallons or 500 pounds of a product, I think the chemical industry itself is going to be developing new chemicals that can be applied in different concentrations, and as much will not have to be carried. The media, news gathering, CNN, I think the story just came out on CNN, and the fact that they now have authority to operate over people. Infrastructure, inspection, chemical facilities, nuclear facilities, security. I will tell you that in my view, the single largest drone market that we're really just starting to see developed, and the FAA has done some testing in Dallas at DFW, Dallas-Fort Worth Airport, is anti-drone technology. And here in that area, guys, you are looking at the major players. You're not looking at the entrepreneurs in terms of using it, but perhaps developing it. You're looking at sports facilities, amusement parks, any nuclear facilities, military facilities, which already have a lot of it. But the thing to recognize there is the single largest anti-drone technology is jamming the signal. You jam the signal, you cause the drone to come straight down, or you assume control of the signal and try to trace it back. The problem is, I apologize for the phone. The problem is that under the federal regulations, and these are the FCC regulations, Federal Communications Commission regulations, jamming radio signals is illegal. Nobody can jam a radio signal but the federal government. So here's another area where the regulatory world is going to have to catch up to technology.
Right, to grant the authority for safety, for public safety purposes.
Exactly.
You mentioned a couple of things that I thought were really interesting stakeholders. So I am in California in the agricultural heart of the United States, basically, in the Central Valley. So it's interesting to me because I was thinking, I wonder how they're going to implement it in agriculture, because I had the same idea. You can't really carry around hundreds of gallons of pesticide in it. But I do think there's got to be some use for them in agriculture, and I can't figure it out. But one of our visitors here, Eric Neitzel, is in fire prevention, I believe, or is a firefighter. And in California right now, he's in Arizona, but in California, we've got the wildfires, and at a couple of points already this year in the major wildfires, and it's wildfire season, at a couple of points, they've had to bring down the planes that are fighting fires because somebody was flying their drone around during. But I'm thinking that the fire prevention, fire safety, firefighting forces would probably find value in being able to observe which way the fire is going rather than putting one of their helicopters in danger.
Right, and then you're exactly right. I think the interference with the tanker aircraft by drones has been a major problem for the last 12, 18 months. And the feds have, in fact, they both at the federal level and the state level, they're taking action by way of laws addressing the flying of drones in the context of forest fires. And you're right. They're going to bring those tankers out of the air immediately. They're going to ground them as soon as the drone gets spotted. But that flip side is exactly what you just said, Nick. These drones provide a very, very economic, expeditious way for the firefighters to observe the spread of the fire, the location, how to send their men out, where to send the tanker, and so forth. So it's this two-edged sword. The technology, honestly. Also, I think where you are, vineyards are using them. In the context of how to fertilize the fields. That's one thing that the farmers are finding with respect to agriculture. And we've got a number of clients that are, I'll call them the commercial agriculture industry. And what they're using them for is what parts of the field need chemicals? What parts of the field need water? So instead of just blanketing the field and the crops, they're able to really target it. And that's really going to turn out to be a huge economic saving and actually much more effective. And that's why they say in terms of the uses, the industrial, commercial uses of drones, agriculture, I suspect by far leads the list. There's no question about it.
Interesting.
Let me add on to that real quick then, Mark. So we talked about the company that's at the forefront, Amazon, and then essentially industries that are going to be at the forefront of using drones. What would you say currently today in 2017, which country is at the forefront of allowing the use of drones? Let's separate the security aspect of it, like you mentioned, safety, because we want to have the safest skies here in the United States. Which country, other than the safety aspect, is allowing the commercial as well as private use of drones?
Yeah, that's a really a good question, Ivan. When this whole thing started, it got started in 2012 with the congressional mandate to integrate drones into the national airspace system. It really started to pick up speed in 13, 14, I would say. At that point, it was pretty clear back in that time frame, 14, 15, that Canada was pretty far along. They had a much more streamlined, for lack of a better word, I'd say licensing process. Europe, some of Australia was seen as someplace that was very hospitable to drones, and I think that continues to be true today. England is obviously hospitable, and Amazon.
England is a surprise because there are quite a few people there. The other two countries obviously are more Spartan in terms of.
I think that's right. But I think the FAA's explanation. The FAA was subject to enormous criticism back at that time. That they're going to drive companies and innovators out of the United States. And the FAA, and in some respects, look, I started my career as an FAA lawyer, and then, a large segment of my career, 15 years, was at the Justice Department Aviation Unit, running all matters aviation for the government, and my biggest client was the FAA. I'm a big fan of the FAA, They, along with the industry, are responsible for the safest airspace in the world. I think to their credit, back when they were being barraged with criticism about moving too slowly, and my view is that it wasn't so much that they moved too slowly, it's that they got started too late. Instead of jumping on this in 2012, what happened is they started tracking down a path, and then when Jim Williams, my current colleague, took over the Flight Standards 80 office, the UAS integration office, they actually stepped back and said, look, we can't do it this way because the industry will never grow. So essentially, for the first year or 2 years, they really had a false start. So they got started too late. But I think the FAA's view was, look, we're not going to compromise safety for expediency. And if you look at that right now, first, the market for drones and drone uses and applications and anti-drone technology, the largest market in the world is going to be the United States. Secondly, Canada has really now sort of tracked in many respects the regulatory framework in the United States. They redid their regulatory framework, and now it's actually, I just read, it's subject to a lot of criticism. Thirdly, the European Union, the EU, through EASA, the European Aviation Safety Agency, which is the sort of the umbrella agency for aviation for all countries in Europe, because, you know, like the United States, you've got these we have separate states, they have separate countries, but so you need to have some common safety regulations. EASA has come out with regulations. So I think what's happening is it's sort of the turtle and the hare. The turtle is slow and steady. The hare bolts out of the starting line. I think the turtle, which some people might characterize as the FAA, is likely going to finish this race well ahead of the hare. And the hare is going to, and people can take issue with this, but the hare is basically going to take the same track and follow the same approach that the FAA follows. I understand the impatience, and let's talk about that for a minute. Amazon is a technology company. We live in a technological world. Silicon Valley moves at a remarkable pace. It's an unregulated universe. In a sense, it's self-regulated by the amount of money that's available by the tech entrepreneurs to develop the technology. But for the most part, there's nobody looking over their shoulder, no regulatory body looking over their shoulder saying, that's great technology, but you can't use it. They just have, and that's why we've had such technological revolutions. That's why the iPhone we're moving, iPhone 8 is the next one. You know, if aviation was developed today instead of in 1903, it'd probably take 10 years instead of 114 years because technology moves so quickly. Now you take all these tech entrepreneurs and the technology of drones in the world that you and I are dealing with, in the commercial, recreational world, put it in a regulated universe, and you get enormous frustration from the tech world. What do you mean I can't use this? What do you mean I can't do this? What do you mean I can't test this? The regulated world of aviation has now sort of come together with the tech world. Yeah. And it's not like the drone world of the military. It's a different world. They have different goals. They're delivering a different product. It's a whole different universe, but the technology is now in a regulated universe of the FAA. Mm-hmm. And most of these tech guys are not accustomed to operating in a regulated world, much less the regulated world of aviation.
Right.
And that's really interesting that they don't have to. They haven't had to do. I like your self-regulation. It's only self-regulation by money. We have a question from Mitch, and we're going to bring Mitch in to ask the question himself because I'm guessing Mitch is going to have a follow-up question for that. So, Mitch, you had a question earlier. What have you got?
First of all, I'm loving the show. Mark, this is fantastic. Thanks for doing this. And for those of you that don't think I'm not all in when it comes to drones, this thing's more than a year old and it's still in one piece. That says something, right? So here's my thoughts. And Ivan and Nick, thanks for having me on. So
Always.
Mark, I grew up flying hang gliders. I'm a Hang 4 expert rated hang glider pilot, but I also have flown RCs for 25, 30 years, which shows my age also. So I get it. And so when I rolled into flying the drone, I actually approached it with a great deal of caution, spent time watching all the videos, reading the regulations, and haven't had any problems. It's been a piece of cake. It's been an enjoyable experience. But with my flying background, as a lawyer, I look at things through a different lens than most people. Because these things are so readily available online and at Best Buy and every place else, any knucklehead in the world can buy one, juice up the battery and throw it up into the air. And what really bothers me is when I see people flying drones over high school football games, over crowded beaches. It gives all of us a bad name, and it's also a safety risk. So my question for you is, for people that are interested in going out and buying a drone, what are the first 2 or 3 things that you recommend that they do from a novice or recreational standpoint to safely learn how to fly a drone, put it up in the air, and not put others at risk, also while protecting the image that the drone industry is, some people feel might be challenging right now?
I think that's a great question. You know, if one area that I would criticize the FAA on these days is I don't think that they have been as aggressive on enforcement and prosecution of people who do exactly what you're saying. They fly it over the high school football game, they fly it into the middle of the fireworks displays, those sorts of things. The very first case that the FAA ever brought was a case called Perker, P-I-R-K-E-R. It was an enforcement action. And Mr. Perker was using a drone to shoot a promotional video for, I think it was UVA, University of Virginia. And he was flying in proximity to people, several feet above the ground. I think he actually flew through a pedestrian tunnel or whatever. And the FAA imposed penalties on him. That went up through the enforcement process. And the challenge that was brought was that drones are not airplanes. And to make a long story short, ultimately the National Transportation Safety Board, or an administrative law judge, decided drones are airplanes. But the FAA went ahead and settled that case for $1,000, which I think was a big mistake.
Right.
They should have sent an object lesson out to everybody out there that thought that, you know, I'm going to do exactly what you said, Mitch. I'm going to juice the battery and I'm going to go out flying, and I don't care. I don't need to know what the rules are. These are toys. These are not toys. These are airplanes. They then brought, ultimately, there's another action out there against a company up in New York called Pan Air, as I recall. And the FAA recently settled that one for a much bigger amount, $200,000. I think what first, and I will address the question of what should people look at. The first thing I would say is the FAA has to step up with enforcement much more aggressively. And criminal authorities, because you have criminal statutes involved, things like reckless endangerment and so forth. I think I'd honestly like to see somebody go to jail because that's a real wake-up call for other people. Now, having said all of that, we really don't know, thank heavens. We really don't know, although I'm reasonably confident I know, what happens if a drone encounters an airplane. What happens if it encounters a helicopter? The DJI drone that you just held up, you got a lithium-ion battery, you have metal parts to it, fiberglass parts to it. These days, there's carbon fiber blades. Some of the drones are carbon fiber. And the payloads of some of the drones are much larger than that small camera. So what happens if that hits the tail rotor of a helicopter? What happens if that gets ingested into a jet engine or even a turboprop? What happens if it hits the windshield of an aircraft? The fact is, we really don't know. There's a lot of analysis out there on terms of birds and bird strikes. We know birds can bring airplanes down, the Miracle on the Hudson. But the FAA, back in decades ago, did lots of testing, and they literally threw defrosted chickens, frozen chickens that have been defrosted, into jet engines at their technical center in Oklahoma City to see what would happen. There's been no testing throwing a DJI drone or any kind of drone into a jet engine or any sort of airplane engine to see what happens. So we really don't know, but my expectation is a jet engine is a pretty delicately balanced system of turbine blades, rotors, and parts in there operating at very high speeds and at very high temperatures. You take a 55-pound drone that's carrying camera equipment or carrying some payload sensors, has turbine, has carbon fiber parts on it, has lithium-ion batteries in it. I don't want to be a passenger or the pilot of the first airplane that has that encounter. I think the first thing that anybody ought to do before they go out and get a drone, and it's fine, it's going to go out, but I think what they ought to do is go on the FAA website, faa.gov. And the FAA website has a whole section on it that's easily findable and is incredibly complete by way of information regarding drones. It's got the Part 107 rules. They can go to the app before you fly and look at the app. And the rules, you know, the Part 107 rules are really very simple. And these days, I guess one of the big controversies has to do with hacking drones, because the software in a lot of the drones, I think several of the manufacturers actually build into their software, onboard software, limitations by way of geography. They've got the airports actually programmed in, and the drone will not go closer than 5 miles to the airport, whether you want to fly it there or not. So I think it's really incumbent upon anybody who's going to operate a drone, even if it's for recreational purposes, even if it's for a birthday present for your 12-year-old kid, to understand exactly what the rules are. You are operating an airplane. You are operating in airspace. And I can think of, you know, nothing more tempting than a kid who's got his DJI drone that he got from his grandfather for Christmas than to take it out in the yard and see how high he can see it, or how high can he get it. And the fact is, he's operating well above the 400 feet, and he's operating in navigable airspace that is transversible by aircraft. So I think the key is understanding what the limitations are and understanding the context in which you're operating.
Yeah, that you touched on, that was a great answer. I'm glad that we covered that. You got to do some preparation and some due diligence before you do this, right? And teach your children to do the same thing before they start flying.
You know, let me interrupt you, Nick. Let me interrupt you and just draw a parallel. You know, nobody would go out and first of all, they won't rent you the airplane, but you know, nobody's going to go out and get into a hang glider. Nobody's going to go out and get into a glider or a Cessna 150, and nobody's going to let you get in there until you've gone to ground school. In those cases, until you have an instructor with you, until you've done a walk around, until you read the manuals. And this is the student pilot who doesn't know how to fly, but there's all these requirements in advance of ever walking out to the airplane. Well, they're not as extensive with drones, but the fact of the matter is, there are things that have to be done before you take that drone outside, even into your yard, in terms of understanding not only what you can do, but more importantly, what you can't do.
Now, is the FAA, real quick, is the FAA holding the manufacturers of drones responsible, or do they have plans of holding them responsible through regulation?
Well, that's a really good question. I think I don't know that
to ensure that they're following the rules of the.
Yeah, I think. Well, first of all, there's no mandate right now. None of the drones out there, no matter the ones that the one you held up, Ivan, or the one that Mitch held up. There's no requirement that any of them be certified. There's no requirement that any approvals, FAA approvals or otherwise. I'll tell you right now.
What I mean by that, I guess, is a kill switch. In areas that you can't fly them.
Yeah, but I'll tell you what's going to drive some of this, and and maybe this is good, maybe this is bad, but it's a symptom of our society. The first time you have an accident and the plaintiff's lawyers get involved, they're the ones that are going to go after the manufacturer. And they're the ones that are going to say, look, there's technology.
Mark, no, you're absolutely right, but let me just share a thought with you.
Go ahead.
And I don't want to get sidetracked. As a hang glider pilot, I would never sue a hang glider manufacturer. The assumption of risk rule is something I'm in favor of.
Oh,
right. And the point is that I love the fact that if you play, you have to assume the risk. But I did want to come back to what Ivan mentioned, because what I'm seeing, Mark, and I've got a friend that I've ridden motocross with for years. He used to be a lawyer. He's a commercial instrument-rated airline pilot, but he also flies drones commercially as a photographer. So
right.
Bill brings me into his world of calling the towers and all the regulations that he follows when he does commercial shoots. Having said all that, what I'm seeing as a layperson, put the professional stuff aside, is I'm seeing a lot of very well-intentioned, nice people going out and buying a new toy and not really thinking it through,
right,
and throwing the toy up into the air. And when I see this happens, it scares me, because somebody's going to get hurt, a chopper's going to be brought down, or something's going to happen. And then that innocent person that really just didn't think it through because they've never flown before, they're going to get prosecuted for what we look at here in California, vehicular manslaughter with an automobile, for example, that type of crime. Their life's going to be turned upside down by a huge civil lawsuit for monetary damages. And I just think that there needs to be some type of public service awareness campaign where people know that when they buy these things at Best Buy on a Saturday morning, or when they click on Amazon and order one from DJI, they understand that there are some responsibilities associated with that, just like driving a car, buying a gun, anything that can cause somebody else harm. There's some common sense reality that I think we're still trying to figure out in the drone industry, right?
Well, I think we are, and it doesn't even have to extend so far as bringing a helicopter down or being ingested into a jet engine. There are incidents that occur with, unfortunately, some regularity in which somebody's flying a drone in their backyard. They lose some control of it, and there's one that comes to mind is it took the eye out of the next door neighbor's child. They flew into the child, the propeller took their eye out. So we're really, it's the cost of becoming a pilot, in a sense, is so low and is available to anybody.
And the liability is so high, potentially.
And the liability is so high. Let me also give you an example. I'm counsel to the UAS Insurance Association. And the UAS Insurance Association, excuse me, is an association of aviation insurers. Now, these are the companies that insure United Airlines, American Airlines, all of the world's airlines. These are the biggest insurance companies, the biggest aviation insurance companies in the world. And they're the ones that write the drone insurance. More often than not, you and I go out and buy a drone, and we say, well, we've got homeowners insurance, so if we fly it on our property, we're fine. Well, the fact is we're generally not fine, because our homeowners policy has an aviation exclusion in it, and it specifically excludes aviation. So the question really becomes, do we have any insurance? And the UAS, the members, these aviation insurers actually write aviation insurance for drones. They write drone insurance. And you can actually get it from several of these companies online. It's on a per flight basis, and you can get it online if you're a commercial operator. And I'll give you another example, the Academy of Model Aeronautics. I think, Mitch, you mentioned RC aircraft.
Right. And that's what I'm involved with, right.
The Academy of Model Aeronautics has been the ardent protector of the recreational user of drones. The ardent protector. And when Congress passed their 2012 legislation, they specifically said that the FAA may not regulate the recreational use of drones. The commercial use, yes, but not the recreational use. But when you join the Academy of Model Aeronautics, and if you are, whether you're a drone user, a drone operator, as a recreational hobbyist, or a radio-controlled aircraft, some big radio-controlled aircraft, you get something in the order of $2 or $2.5 million in liability insurance coverage. So I would quite literally encourage anybody that's a hobbyist flying drones to join the Academy of Model Aeronautics, if for no other reason other than get the insurance protection.
Mm. That is the reason that I'm a member and always have been, even flying RC planes. I had a gentleman walk across. We're flying over the ocean, our gliders, and while I'm bringing my glider around to land back on top, this gentleman walks across in front of me, and the glider comes in high speed and hits him in the back. My brother-in-law was videotaping the whole thing, and it made for a very entertaining video. And fortunately, the guy was okay, and it was no big deal. But that, if that had hit somebody in the head, or if a drone hit somebody in the head at high speed, that could be very, very dangerous.
Right. Absolutely.
Hey, before I pop off, I want to show you guys a little toy that I did for my drone. Mark, you'll get a kick out of this. So for those of you who don't fly, this is the way the drones are set up. This is the camera. I've got a Samsung Gear 360 that I mount to the bottom of my struts when I fly, okay? And it shoots a 360 video when I fly. We then invert the video upside down when we edit it and then share it on YouTube. It's a really cool way for people to watch you fly. It's not live, it's recorded. But while they're looking at the video, Mark, they can use their finger or their mouse and they can scan around and look at that hawk that flew by and watch where it's going while you're flying the other direction. It's really cool technology. I'm still trying to work out some of the vibration issues, but we're going to get there. This is what I do on my weekends.
That sounds good. I just, you mentioned a hawk, and I just brought to mind something. I mentioned anti-drone technology. One of the anti-drone technologies that's being used somewhere in one of the European countries is trained hawks. And if somebody spots a drone, they release the hawk, and the hawk brings the drone down. But I somehow, guys, I don't see that as getting widespread application.
Right.
I'll be keeping my eyes open for seagulls out here. Hey, guys, thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it. Mark, it was nice to meet you.
Hey.
Ivan and Nick, it's always good to see you. You guys take care.
Thanks for jumping in, Mitch. And we're going to have, Ivan is going to ask one last question. We won't want to take up your whole Saturday here, Mark. We appreciate it. But Ivan's got one last question here, and then we're going to wrap up for the day. But as we can see with the number of people who have popped in and who are interested, I'm sure Eric Neitzel, who's got a drone business, I thought he was in fire prevention. He's got a drone business where he does agriculture and vegetation. I think we'd love to have you back in the future based on the number of questions and the comments we're getting here. So we'd love it if you'd be willing to do so in the future.
Absolutely. I'd be happy to do it.
Great.
Because this industry is so fluid, and absolutely, I would love to have you on. Real quick, last question. So, if you were the drone czar, whatever that's worth in the administration or at the FAA, wherever it may be resident, what would be your suggestion on how we should move forward to be able to use drones safely, and then essentially bring them in today's reality of the accessibility of them, but as well as essentially encapsulating everything we've discussed? What 2 or 3 things would you recommend that the FAA do to expedite the use, the commercial use, the private use, but then also incorporate the safety aspect?
I'll tell you, that's a tough question. It's a good question, but it's a tough question. I think what I would like to see happen And I think it's going to happen. And if I ruled the world the way you suggest, I'm not sure I could make it happen any more quickly. I'm not sure I could make it happen any more quickly than it should. But I don't think that the FAA ought to be in the business of promoting the growth of the drone industry. I think the FAA ought to be strictly in the business of regulating the safety of the drone industry. And in fact, they've split that responsibility now really into two different people. Earl Lawrence and the Drone Integration Office sort of does the regulatory side, and a fellow named Hoot Gibson is an advisor to the administrator, and his is really the industry side. But, and I guess I don't have a great answer as to who should have the responsibility for promoting its growth, because I'm not sure it needs anybody to promote its growth. This industry is moving at a breakneck speed, and I think the only thing in many respects holding it back is the regulatory universe not permitting it to operate at the speed that it would like to. That's the price we pay for putting drones up in the airspace. So I guess what I would like to see is the FAA focusing strictly on the regulatory safety side and let the industry, in terms of promotion and growth, sort of move at its own pace, recognizing it's never going to move as fast as it wants to. I guess if number 2 on the list would be to maybe just strictly looking at drones. The problem is the FAA doesn't have that luxury. They have to look at a whole sort of smorgasbord of issues, is to perhaps move drones up to a higher level in terms of priority. The other thing I'd really like to see is because I frankly, even as I sit here and I try to keep out in front of what's going on, the anti-drone technology issue. It's being looked at, it's being examined. Honestly, guys, I believe that industry is going to be bigger from a monetary perspective than even the drone industry, because you're going to be talking about major oil companies, chemical companies, refining companies. Everybody is going to want anti-drone technology. They're going to want to have it at their facilities. They're going to want to be able to protect against, the kid who inadvertently flies his drone over the stadium, or the people that want to do harm to us and fly the drone into the stadium. And I'm imagining they'd want to protect against potential industrial espionage too. Exactly. And even the farmer wants to keep his neighbor's drones away from his field. So there's a lot of proprietary concern about those areas. But I think those would be the focuses I have. But do I criticize the FAA for moving too slowly? I really can't. I'm a guy that spent too many years in a sort of, not literally, although in some instances literally, standing at smoking holes in the ground caused by aircraft accidents. We don't need any more of those. And I think the FAA is moving methodically. But again, I think that they're under a lot of pressure and a lot of criticism. Mark, that is I think an excellent way to end the
I could go for another 8 hours, guys.
Yeah, Ivan wants to keep it up. I think based on the folks who are sticking around to watch, they want to keep it up. But I think that's a good spot for us to stop on this initial of probably more than one interview with Mark Dombroff from Dentons, because people seem to really be interested in this subject, and it's a growth area. So, Mark, where can people find you if they want to get in touch? I think, first of all, I'll give you my email, and I'll also give you my Twitter account. It's at Mark Dombroff, DOMBROFF. And email is mark.dombroff@dentons, DENTONS.com. And you can also take a look at our blog that you mentioned, It's www.plainly, Planely, plainlyspokenblog.com. And I welcome and invite anybody that wants to get in touch or follow me to do so.
And you represent at the national level the largest airlines down to what? Or is that it? You're just in
no. Everybody from major airlines to charter operators to airports, ground handlers, fueling companies. Just the full spectrum, manufacturers, the full spectrum of the aviation industry.
Excellent. So I think it was Ross that who was Eric that may be interested in making contact there.
Yeah.
For his protection, because he has a drone business.
Got a drone business, and and he did correct me that he is in fire prevention, fire safety as well.
Well, absolutely. In terms of the drone business, I find it kind of interesting. I know you guys got to go. That even the most sophisticated companies, sophisticated manufacturing companies, chemical companies that find themselves in the drone world, find themselves asking questions about, well, how do we write contracts to protect ourselves vis-a-vis drones, whether we're supplying them or using them. And it's a whole area that really has given rise to a whole new set of questions.
Excellent. Well, I want to thank you again, Mark. You were
I
so
second that.
Yeah, you were so willing to come on, which is, and just from a random contact through Twitter, and that's always nice when somebody's so willing to jump right in and do this and be willing to be live on video and record. So thank you so much. Our guest today, it was Mark Dombroff. He is a aviation attorney from Denton's, located in Washington, D.C. area.
Virginia, Mark, Tyson's Corner, right?
Right.
Get it right.
I'm sorry. Virginia.
He's outside the swamp.
I'm outside the swamp, or outside the Beltway. So thank you again, Mark. This is Nick Rishwain with my
Ivan Rakelin. Yep.
Ivan Rakelin. And Ivan, I'd like to bring back something that we haven't done in a while when we close out. Can we get a fist bump from everybody?
Oh, yeah, I always do that.
Right up to there. Thank you all for being here, and thank you for joining and listening in to Legal Tech Live, episode 31.